Hello, everyone. I'm Kirk Schroder. I'm an entertainment attorney outside of Washington, D.C., and I want to welcome you to Brief Encounters. And today I'm very excited to have as our guest Jeremy Fuster, who is a reporter covering the box office and labor issues for TheWrap. And I highly recommend TheWrap. I read it as an entertainment attorney, and there's a lot of good stuff there. It's a very good independent voice on what's going on in Hollywood. Jeremy is covering the Writers Guild strike. And by now, everyone has heard that the Writers Guild strike is going on. In fact, I had a deal earlier this morning with agents at William Morris, and the whole deal was getting soured by the strike. And so it's very much a factor for people doing business in the entertainment business. But it's also a good opportunity for those that are fans of entertainment and other lawyers and people who listen to this podcast to just learn a little deeper about what these issues are. So Jeremy's going to talk with us about what's the fight about and what everyone is arguing over with respect from the writer's standpoint and the producer's standpoint. So Jeremy, welcome to Brief Encounters, and thanks for doing this.
And thank you for having me.
All right, Jeremy, what are the major issues going on each side? I don't know if you want to start with the producers or the writers, but what is this strike all about?
Well, let's start with the writers. On May 2nd, I went up to the Netflix headquarters, day one of the strike, talked with a lot of people, several members of the negotiating committee, and all of them said that they feel that the business of being a writer is under an existential threat. That they feel like right now, the big streamers, particularly like Netflix and Apple and Amazon, that they're using the streaming boom to force through changes that would just dismantle the whole structure of how writers' rooms work since the days of I Love Lucy. For decades, the way it would work is you would get your start as a writer's assistant or a staff writer on a TV show, and then you would work your way up, and you would write an episode, and then you'd get to be a part of that episode's production all the way through and gain the experience of being able to work on a TV show.
And I'll jump in and say that that's a critical deal point. And having represented writers over the years, getting into the writer's room and staying there and working up is an important issue. And having your name as a writer's credit, because you don't just automatically get into the WGA. You have to have a certain amount of experience measured by hours of broadcast or otherwise.
What's happening now is the streamers, because they spend all these hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on these productions, a lot of times they'll say to a writer with a project, well, this pilot script looks interesting, but we don't know what the budget is going to be for a full series. So we want you to produce more scripts before we greenlight it. And so writers have to put together something called mini rooms, where they hire several staff writers and they do the whole writing process before the show is even greenlit. Sometimes they do all that work and they'll get paid minimum rates, but the show doesn't get greenlit. And even if it does get greenlit, those streamers try to save money by only keeping the showrunner around to oversee the production of all of these episodes. So not only does the showrunner have to do the work of what a full writer's room would break up as they're overseeing production of the episodes, those staff writers aren't getting the experience of working through the whole production process. And because of that, they can't work their way up to being a script editor and then a writer producer and then maybe one day becoming a showrunner with their own project of their own. The whole pipeline is getting broken up by this. So what the Writers Guild was proposing, and there were several big sticking points, but this was the biggest one, was that they wanted to put provisions in the contract that basically baked the whole concept of the writer's room into the contract. It would require a minimum number of writers, depending on the number of episodes, to remain employed through the entire process. That's just one of several things they wanted to protect writers from being abused by mini rooms. And the AMPTP, which is the organization that represents the studios, they did not even provide a counteroffer on this. And there were several other issues where they did not provide a counteroffer. And it got to the point where they had to strike. And what the WGA has said since then is that the only way we're going to go back to the negotiating table is if the AMPTP provides a counteroffer on everything in our contract. They can't just cherry pick things or give us higher, minimum rate increases in exchange for dropping certain things. Like, these are existential things. And I hadn't even gotten into AI, but
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that in just a second, but finish off the thought.
the big point is that a lot of people talk about the nature of the writer's room really damaging the potential for this next generation of writers. Like, I talked with the co-creator of Friends, Marta Kaufman, who said, she's still getting paid well, but her writers are not getting paid well, and they don't have the opportunities that she had to be able to build up the experience to become a big showrunner. And that's going to damage the future of television 10, 15, 20 years down the line.
Yeah, yeah. And essentially, just for our audience, they're forcing writers now to basically write a whole season on spec, essentially,
Yeah.
without having the ability to go through that process and, for lack of a better description, to have apprenticeship in writing and working and developing. Because, the writing is a creative process, and people have to gel and get to understand their craft. And that's an important process. Well, let me go back. Flagged AI. How big a concern is AI right now for the writers?
It is either number one or number two on every writer's list. It's writers' rooms and AI. Those are the big two right now. And there's already language in the contract saying that the studio cannot greenlight a script written by ChatGPT. But what the WGA is concerned about is that a studio could take such a script or some sort of AI story and tell a writer, adapt a screenplay from this. And that is what they're trying to nail down. But here is the big problem. It's not just this year, it's with any year. A lot of times, the labor guilds, especially the WGA, they see a lot of potential for abuse on things like AI and things like that. And they try to use these labor negotiations to cut it off at the pass. But the AMPTP does not want to negotiate on hypothetical things. If they can't quantify it in a dollars and cents way over the next 3 years of the contract, they don't want to talk about it. So that's what happened in 2007 with streaming. Streaming was a very new concept at the time, and the AMPTP didn't want to pay the writers on all these residuals and lock themselves into these pay structures because they said, we don't know if streaming is going to work. How are we going to do this without advertising? And then House of Cards comes out and Netflix is off to the races. That changes everything. And even 2 years ago, I was hearing WGA people saying we got rolled in 2007 on streaming. But the AMPTP was able to get away with it because they use, they're saying like, we don't know how this is going to work. And right now they're saying, we don't know how AI is going to work. So the studios don't want to lock themselves into these restrictions on AI. And they use the defense of, well, nobody's using AI in a serious way yet on scripts as a way to deflect from that. And the WGA isn't buying that.
Yeah. Any other significant issues worth noting on the writer's side?
Well, there's some other ones. I just put out a story on feature writers. There are feature writers in the WGA who feel like their concerns are kind of taking a backseat to TV.
And for our audience, feature means motion pictures, as we know
motion
them.
picture or
Whatever the full feature 90-minute or so 120-minute film that people normally see.
Yeah, so part of that's because when a strike happens, TV is much more immediately hit than movies. Also because with the rise in streaming, a greater percentage of WGA writers are TV writers rather than feature writers. That's part of it. But right now, what WGA people are concerned about is that right now, I cover box office, and the big blockbusters still work at the box office, and low budget films can still work. But then you've got these mid-budget movies, very few of them per year work.
What's the number on mid-budgets? It used to be long ago, 15 million, 20 million was mid-budget. I'm just curious what that is today.
Yeah, these days, I think you had to move the bar a little bit up because of inflation. Like Blumhouse horror movies, they used to make them on $3.5 million. Now, because of inflation, they make them on 8 to 12 million. I would say these days, what you would call mid-budget would be between 20 million and 80 million.
Okay, that's about right.
That's considered mid-budget. Like Creed 3 was made on $75 million. That's considered like a mid-budget movie. But a lot of those mid-budget mature dramas don't get released in theaters these days. And streamers are still really interested in them. Netflix is really interested in them. Apple TV is still really interested in them. And on one hand, that's a good thing. But what they're concerned about right now is that streamers are doing away with what they call a two-step process, where the first step the writer gets paid half of the first step pay when the project starts, and then they get the other half when they turn in the script. But then they're also guaranteed a second step of pay, a slightly less bit of money for a rewrite of the script. And a lot of writers are not getting that second step anymore. So the WGA is trying to lock in the two-step pay process if writers are getting paid less than a certain threshold. I think right now that threshold is like 150,000. Keep in mind, 150,000. These writers are getting paid 150,000 for between 6 to 9 months of working on a single script. So $150,000 over 6 months in Los Angeles, depending on whether or not you have a family, that may not go as far as if you're living in Waco, Texas, or something like that. So that was another thing that locking in that two-step pay process. That was another thing that the AMPTP did not offer a counteroffer on. I've heard a couple of feature writers who are really cynical, like they really feel like feature writer pay might end up being left on the cutting room floor if whenever they go back to the negotiating table, like they give that up in exchange for getting the TV stuff done because that affects more members. I think it's premature to say at this point whether or not that would be the case, because the WGA has a lot more leverage, a lot more membership drive to get everything than they did in past negotiation cycles. But it is a concern that I heard. And part of the reason why I wrote the story is because I feel like we talk so much about TV when it comes to this strike, but film writing is writing too, and they have their own concerns.
Well, it's interesting, one, how technology has gotten so ahead of even the industry economic structures. And, when you were talking about an existential threat to the writers, when you really think about it, it is an existential threat to really how the WGA gets members, because it's not easy getting into the WGA. I mean, there are a lot of people that like to get in the WGA, and, there are milestones or benchmarks, if you will. And that whole structure now is being dramatically affected by really the outcome of these negotiations or the strike.
Yeah, and it's not a cure-all solution to that. But I think one thing that I've heard a lot of members say is during the strike, I've seen them tweet, if you're pre-WGA, like you're that kind of writer who wants to get into WGA but needs experience, like, even if you're pre-WGA, we consider you WGA, come out and strike with us. So I think what some writers are trying to do is use the picket lines as networking opportunities for the pre-WGA writers.
Because otherwise they'll do non-union work, right?
Yeah, so it's like, get out there, tell us your story, tell us what you're interested in, what you're writing on, and network with people and get into writers' rooms. It's even with the expanded number of jobs that the stream move is given, it is hard to get your foot into the industry, especially when it's such a hire who you know kind of business. But I think over the last few years, between this strike and what the WGA recently had a big labor action regarding packaging fees with agencies. That's another whole thing that I could spend 30 minutes talking about. But the point being that there was a time when the WGA members were working without their talent agents, and they relied on each other to network and to get hiring. They used that as an opportunity to try to help get new WGA members and pre-WGA members to get hired by having writers hire each other rather than relying on talent agents.
Yeah, and you still had the issue like with William Morris Endeavor that would be a talent agency, but then you walk down the hall at William Morris and they have their own production entity, Endeavor. That was a big issue back then. All right, I think you've outlined some of where the studios are. What is it? Just all economics, or what's worth noting on where the studios stand on this?
Well, this is where the irresistible force meets the immovable object. As I mentioned, one of the big things that the WGA is pushing for is minimum staffing requirements to eliminate the abuse of the mini rooms. It's to ensure that the younger staff writers are able to become writer producers on episodes that they write. That used to just be a given in the pre-streaming days, but is now not a given. And Every studio person I have spoken with just said that is a non-starter. There's no way any studio is going to agree to that because the studios see it as their prerogative to have control over employment. And they're not going to like being told by any labor union that they're required to hire this many number of people. And I think of everything else, I think they might be able to eventually get movement on things like AI. But when it comes to things that the studios see as hands off, this is like our prerogative, this is our privilege, I really think that could be a very difficult impasse. But the WGA, they've got tens of thousands of their own members, not to mention they've probably got more intra-union solidarity from the other unions than they've ever had on a strike. They're going to push for this. So right now, both sides aren't moving on it. And I'm wondering how long it will take for one side to blink.
What will that impact be on the average TV viewer or motion picture viewer?
Well, for the motion pictures, it's a much more dependent on the production because there are some productions that were already well deep into shooting, and these are movies that are coming out in 2024, etc. But there are other ones that are getting delayed. Like I know it's really having a lot of effect on Marvel movies. Maybe that's only because they're really prominent, so news breaks out about them. But I know that Marvel Studios has paused production on Thunderbolts, which is supposed to be one of their summer 2024 movies. Production on Deadpool 3 is continuing, but because there's no writer on set to approve changes to the script, Ryan Reynolds is not allowed to ad lib the way he always does his Deadpool. So he has to go strictly by the script. Now, maybe they do reshoots after the strike ends that will boost the budget, and be able to do the reshoots, allow them to ad lib or whatever like that. But that's the kind of examples of a movie getting impacted by the strike. TV, and it's already going to have some sort of impact because usually showrunners on fall TV shows start assembling their writers' rooms in May and June. So that process is already getting pushed back. Beyond that, what I have heard from people is that they expect the strike to at least last through mid-August. And the reason for that is because the studios are incentivized right now to wait this thing out until July or mid-August, because then they can use force majeure clauses to break any showrunner production deals with people that they feel like they're not getting their money's worth on them. And right now, with Wall Street telling them that you have to cut back on spending and all this stuff, that allows them to take billions and billions of dollars off of the books for several years to come. So there is an incentive for them to wait this out. After that, we'll see. That's when it's going to break down on a studio by studio basis where they are and what their needs are. They'll determine whether or not they want to go back to the negotiating table.
So, Jeremy, the whole issue has complexity, certainly among the three unions. You've got the Directors Guild, the DGA, and obviously we've been talking about SAG-AFTRA and, of course, the WGA. Tell me how they're on the same page or not. I know the DGA right now, the directors have a proposed deal, and that appears like it's going to go through. And what does that do to the other two unions? And we'll talk about some differences from there. Any observations on that point?
Well, they're all very much on the same page, and they've all released statements of solidarity with each other. And there have been past contract cycles where that was not the case. Back during the last writers' strike, the DGA pretty much had an open shut contract negotiation period where the DGA was very, very quiet when it came to the WGA strike, didn't really show much solidarity, at least among the leadership. And that frustrated a lot of the writers. But this time around, there has been a lot of active support. When I've been to the picket lines, every single time I see signs that say DGA supports the Writers Guild or SAG-AFTRA supports the Writers Guild, IATSE supports the Writers Guild. You will find at least one picket at every single line where it's people marching and from other guilds marching in solidarity.
Yeah, but the DGA looks like they're on the path to making a deal, right?
Yeah, right now the DGA members are in a voting period on whether to ratify their contract. That voting period closes on June 23rd. And every time there's a big labor contract, there's always debate online of whether or not to vote for it. What's difficult to say is whether the people who are opposed to it, whether there is a significant upswell of opposition or whether it's a vocal minority. I remember 3 years ago with the SAG after contract, there was a very, very loud opposition, but that contract ended up being approved with 76% of the vote. But then on the other hand, you have the IATSE contract in 2021, where it passed by the most narrowest of margins. It only reason it passed is because it represents all these different locals. They use this very archaic electoral college-esque voting system. It's not just a straight popular vote, and it only passed because of that electoral college system. It was the narrowest of
What
margins.
you would expect from crew.
Yeah, it was very narrow, and a lot of people were very bitter about it.
Got it.
Right now, it's hard to say either way, but I have seen members of the DGA, some of whom are also members of the Writers Guild, who have said they're voting no, and there are various reasons why. Some are saying that the protections that the contract has against AI abuse, they feel don't go far enough. There are others who feel like even though the studios are giving the directors a big boost in streaming residuals, that they feel like they're just doing that to keep the viewership data that streamers have under wraps. And there are others who I remember there was one DGA member who released a video. And he said that I think this is a very good contract, but I'm voting no on this because we need to stand in solidarity with the WGA and the SAG-AFTRA, and he fears that approving the DGA contract would decrease the leverage that WGA and SAG-AFTRA have in their talks. The guild leaders cannot do that. They have to negotiate in good faith only for the interests of their own members, but that doesn't preclude the members from voting on these contracts for whatever reason, and that reason can include they want to push for a better deal for other guilds, and
Yeah,
that's a kind of inter-union solidarity, not just among the leadership, but now amongst the members that we don't always see in Hollywood labor contract talks.
Yeah. Well, and you were mentioning, I mean, it gets even more complicated because you have directors that are writers. And I'm sure the Writers Guild has rules right now about what directors can't do. So what part of the directing process is really operating as a writer, which would be, going against the strike, and what part of a director's duties, if they're rewriting a script or they're polishing something or they're doing something that falls within the writer's portion. How does that affect? These, I guess, so-called hyphen.
Yeah, hyphenates are what they're called in Hollywood. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, any thoughts on that? Is that creating an issue between the directors and the writers?
There was a bit of a dispute early on, a bit of dispute between the WGA and the DGA over what constituted activity that they had to strike from, but I remember that was pretty quickly resolved. In general, what the WGA is saying is if you are working on a project in a writer capacity, you have to stop. There are members of both the WGA and the DGA, or WGA and SAG-AFTRA, who are working on projects but not in a writer capacity, and they are continuing. Those are very, very few at this point. And there have also been some efforts by the studios to try to pressure the showrunners to go back to work because they were saying that, as showrunners, you're not only writers, you're also producers on the show. Mm-hmm. And under your production contract, you're obligated to continue working as producers. And the showrunners, almost all to a man, along with the Writers Guild, told them to shove it. They're like, no, we're calling your bluff. Our strike will strictly say that they call it A through H production work. Working as a showrunner, producing work is writer work, and we are not doing that.
Yeah.
So there have been, on an individual basis, some complications where they've had to check with the respective guilds to make sure that they were not violating anything. But at this point, just given the fact that so many productions have shut down 5-6 weeks in, that I think that's pretty much been resolved at this point.
Got it. Yeah. It's interesting too, because, the majority of SAG-AFTRA voting members, the majority of Writer Guild members are not full-time, do not make their living full-time on, on writing and or acting. Yet they probably represent the vast majority of the unions. and you have maybe the top 10% of those members that really do make their living full time. Do you sense any conflict between the upper 10% that actually are making full time living, either acting or writing, versus those who are members but maybe work part time or get a script every now and then or get an acting job every now and then, and how they vote?
I don't think there's conflict in the sense that that top 10% is working against the interests of the rest of the group. Though I have heard from some members, I was just at the Disney picket line, and there was one member who said he was calling on who he called the members who are in the upper tax bracket to show more leadership. There are some up there like Conan O'Brien who have been very visible on the strike lines and in speaking out. There have been, the president of the WGA right now is the creator of Cold Case, one of the many hit CBS police procedurals that have come out over the years. There are members of those top moneymakers who have been very visible on the strike lines. There are other members who want others from that group to follow their example. But like I said earlier, like the showrunners all told the studios when they tried to move to get them to come back to work, no, we're sticking with our union. And I think just on that front, we're not seeing any real conflict of interest there. And I have heard from several showrunners like Marta Kaufman, who's one of the creators of Friends, who said that she's trying to be a leader in this strike because she sees that for younger generations of screenwriters, the pipeline of going from a staff writer to becoming a showrunner is getting broken up. And if they don't take a stand now, the writers that are getting experience in their writers' rooms on their projects are going to be stuck jammed in neutral for decades.
Yeah. This past week, I had several non union writers asking me about if they work on any projects, will that affect their ability to join the WGA? And I suspect, I mean, at least I've heard through, entertainment lawyer friends in LA and New York, the WGA is taking names, or at least when they're considering new members down the road, they're going to try to determine if a non-union writer worked during the strike and how that might view their ability to get into the union. Have you heard anything around that line where the WGA is taking names, so to speak?
Yes, they absolutely are. It's very much, they see anyone who's called supposedly pre-WGA who takes work from these studios, that is considered strike breaking activity and would be grounds for the guild to deny membership if those writers applied. I have not heard yet how common that is because, again, I feel like there's such an understanding among writers, whether they're in the guild or not at this point, that they all see this as an existential struggle for the future of writing as a profession. And I think the vast majority of pre-WGA writers understand that this is their future as well that is at stake, and they are a part of this. In fact, I also think that another thing that the WGA members are doing, it's not just a stick thing. There's also a bit of a carrot thing that they're inviting pre-WGA writers to come onto the picket lines and use as a sort of networking. Meet WGA guild writers and get a foothold and get to know people, and maybe those people will hire you when all of this is done. That is another incentive for these non-guild members to not take the work. Although I have heard from one source, and I'm trying to see how far this has gone, but one source who received an email, she's pre-WGA, and she received an email from Netflix asking if she wanted to join their apprenticeship program, which, again, that's also considered strike-breaking activity. And I'm digging into that to see, is this actually happening, or are there studios that are trying to do this?
Yeah, I mean, that seems like such a short-sighted decision, because once a contract is signed with, say, the studios, then that person can't be on board anymore, right? Because they're not a member of the union and they're likely to get rejected. That just seems such a short-sighted move by a writer like that.
Yeah.
But so let me ask, a few minutes. I know the LA City Council just weighed in, and in the past, we've had governments weigh in. One, let me ask you, how long do you think this is going to go? Entertainment lawyer friends out in LA tell me they're predicting the end of August, probably by the fall. You think it'll go that long? You think it's a much more a deeper fight where everybody's just going to dig in, and we're going to need, a government agency or some sort of other third party intervention to just tell people to, make a deal? Because obviously, the longer this goes on, it affects vendor. I mean, it affects the economy, especially in the key areas like where you're located. It's not just the entertainment business, but those that depend on those, entertainment related revenues for their business. What do you think?
Well, I would be surprised if there was any sort of government intervention because, on the federal level, Hollywood is not the railroads. So there's not a federal incentive for them to try and break up a strike there. And on the local and state level, with Governor Gavin Newsom in California and with local officials like Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, if you try to intervene on that, I just think it would risk blowing up back in your face. You're either going to be angering the studios, who are massive political donors, or you're angering a huge voter base in Los Angeles. So the Hollywood workers, in particular the writers, are getting more and more organized in local politics in Los Angeles, and they're not going to take kindly if they see a politician, trying to squelch their strike. So I would be surprised on that, but no.
So how long do you see this going? It's a summer long activity, end of the year. Everyone seems to be digging in, or what do you think?
What I've told everybody is that I'm expecting this to go at least through August. My prediction here is predicated on the idea that SAG-AFTRA is going to make a deal. If they don't make a deal and they go on strike, and that would be the first double strike in Hollywood since 1960, then forget everything. All bets are off. I don't know what happens then. I think some studios would start panicking very quickly. But assuming SAG-AFTRA reaches some sort of a deal and it's just the writers, I think it goes at least until August because the studios have the incentive to wait out until August so they can use the force majeure clauses to break up any deals that they've had with the big name writers, those big 1% writers that they feel they're not getting the return on investment on. Right now, Wall Street is telling them, you got to cut down on costs. We have heard studios like Disney say that they are scaling back the number of shows they're greenlighting, the amount of production spending that they're doing, among other spending. So taking billions of dollars in production deal money off the books is something that they would very much want to do, and the strike would give them a perfect justification to do that. After that happens, that's when things get interesting because it's going to start getting into September. There are going to be legacy studios, their television divisions are going to want to go back to work and they're going to be pushing to go back to the table. And then the question is, how much do the streamers, who have been the ones pushing for the mini rooms, been pushing for a lot of the abuses that the Writers Guild are pushing back against, how much should they dig in? And there are different scenarios that could happen. Maybe the legacy studios went out, forced the AMPTP to go back to the table and really give a full counteroffer to the WGA's proposed contract, or non-zero chance, I don't know how likely this is, the WGA goes around the AMPTP and starts negotiating with the studios on an individual basis.
Ah,
The reason why the AMPTP exists is because they are the labor representative for the studios. It's the idea of, we'll do all the talking for all of you so you don't have to be doing this. And by extension, for the unions, it's convenient too, because they don't have to be doing the same talks on a studio by studio basis over and over and over again. But 2 years ago, when the WGA was fighting on packaging fees with the talent agencies and they had a walkout of all the agencies, the guild just negotiated on a agency by agency basis on new agreements. And it started with the tiny little boutique agencies and then just worked their way up to the really, really big ones. So that is a possibility. All I know is that right now for the WGA, I think the strike continues at least through the end of July, probably until mid-August. And then we'll see after they start cutting some of these deals where things stand.
okay. And so I hear you saying SAG-AFTRA members may want to vote against a deal to support their fellow writers, but then I also hear you saying maybe they'll make a deal anyway.
Well, no, right now the DGA are the ones that are currently voting on their proposed contract.
Mhm.
SAG-AFTRA is currently in their talks on a possible contract. they don't have a contract yet to bring to the members for a vote. So there is a possibility where maybe the Directors Guild members reject their contract and force their leadership to resume negotiations. There is also a possibility on the SAG-AFTRA side that the SAG-AFTRA negotiators don't reach a deal by the end of June, and then they issue a strike order. So there's a lot of different ways those other ones can pan out. And there are certain members of the WGA, the guild itself, the leaders won't ever say this. They're all in solidarity. But there are some members of the Writers Guild who I think are secretly hoping that one or both of the other guilds join them in striking because it just gives them more leverage.
I was just going to say they need at least one of the unions, probably preferably the actors, that would have a great leverage if they stuck with them and rejected their deal.
The last double strike, which happened in 1960, that was a strike that led to the creation of residuals for TV reruns and home video. So that this whole talk of residuals is only happening because of that double strike 63 years ago.
Got it. Okay. All right. So just last question is, as we wind up, this has been very interesting, and it is a complex issue, especially for those that are tied to the entertainment industry. To our general audience, over the next few months, what are the key things to look for people who are reading about this and follow this? What are the key milestones or indicators that you think would be indicating where this is all going to go?
Well, the next two milestones come up pretty quick. June 23rd, Friday night of June 23rd, is the end of the voting period for the Directors Guild, and we will hear whether or not the contract was approved. If it's approved, DGA is done. Their part in this negotiating cycle is complete. If not, then things get weird. Then the Directors Guild has to figure out what new demands they're going to have to bring to the table, and the whole process starts again for them. After that, about a week later, will be the deadline for the contract for SAG-AFTRA. And at that point, SAG-AFTRA may announce that they have reached a tentative agreement on a contract, and they will get it approved by the national board and then send it to the members. And there will probably be a very, very heated debate on whatever contract that is, as there usually is. Or they announce that they don't have a deal and they feel that they're at a complete impasse, and they announce that they are going on strike. So the end of June is going to bring a lot of events that will really shape the contours of how the writer's strike goes forward, and whether or not it's going to be a situation where one or both of the other guilds join them on the picket lines, or they finish up their business, and then it's a matter of, is the AMPTP going to answer the demands of the Writers Guild, which has drawn a very hard line on what it's going to take to get the talks going again.
Okay. Any last thoughts, Jeremy, before we sign off?
I just think that there is definitely a lot of nervousness among the labor members, and a feeling of they don't want to hear from their members. The stuff we didn't get, we'll get in the next contract cycle. There is a feeling right now of like, if we don't get it, we're never, ever going to get it, because everyone's thinking about what happened with streaming back in 2007. And they're looking at things like AI. They're looking at how streaming continues to change the industry. And there is a lot of big existential nervousness. I just feeling like if we don't get it now, it's never going to happen. How much of that is true is hard to say, but that is a lot of the mentality that is driving all of these labor issues in Hollywood. It's like, this is something that's been broiling for over a decade, and now something's got to give.
Okay. All right. Well, we're just about out of time, but Jeremy, thank you so much for this. We may ask you back. This is Kirk Schroder for Brief Encounters from the DC Bar. Thank you for listening, and we'll hope you'll listen to our podcast in the future. Take care.